Hey everybody, welcome back. I know it's been a while since I've posted a video, but I've actually been working on a project and it's taken me a little bit longer than I thought just because of the methods of research I'm having to go through. It's actually a new series and I think people are really going to like it once it comes out. But I've decided to work smaller videos in around the project just because there are a lot of smaller topics that I still want to cover. So tell your friends, your neighbors, that one guy you don't see until the fall when y'all watch college football together Saturday and drink away the worries of the week, to subscribe so they don't miss that project or any of my other videos. In today's college football landscape, it seems like there are monumental changes every single offseason. The game we'll watch this fall doesn't necessarily seem like the same that we watched it in the fall of 2019, and that was only 5 years ago. What if we compared it to 5 years before then? Well, that's what we're going to do today. We're going to take a look back at what college football looked like a decade ago and examine the 2014 season. I'll see you on the other side. For some, the biggest story of the offseason was that this would be the first time in 20 years that there would not be an NCAA football video game released prior to the start of the season. And that's because EA released their last game in June of the prior year and ended production of the game due to concerns over player NIL and corresponding lawsuits. Look, I can totally understand the player side of things. I mean, they were kind of the driving force of sales for the game. For example, everybody wanted to get a copy of NCAA 14 to play with a Johnny Manziel model that had updated stats. And they also wanted to play with the new schools that were added, Georgia State, Old Dominion, and South Alabama. Yet, these players wouldn't see a penny from the sale of the game, while the institutions had agreements to appear in the game on contract with EA. This would lead to a decade-long absence of the game that a large fan base relied on, and that gave rise to communities committed to keeping the game alive and fun, and eventually leading to the CFB Revamp Group, who did their best to make it feel like a new game altogether. They did so well, in fact, that a number of the people from that community got hired by EA to work on the new version of the game that they announced in February 2021. After some delays, it is expected to be released in July of 2024. Now, just for about everyone else who wasn't part of that game's fan base, the biggest story of the offseason was the introduction of the 4-team CFP format. For years, decades even, fans have been arguing about who was really the national champion and how things would be different had another set of teams played for the Crystal Football. The NCAA had thought that they put an end to debates with the BCS, but sometimes that just led to even more arguments as fans and pundits alike felt like the two best teams didn't always get selected for the championship game. People wanted a playoff format, similar to that of every other sport, whether pro or collegiate. Heck, even the FCS had playoffs, and their format was still 10 times better than that of the 4-team CFP. But, as we always say, talk loud enough and the NCAA will listen. And what they came up with is a new ranking system that debuts in October and still ranks the top 25 teams, but only the top 4 after conference championship week will get into the playoffs. And with this new format, they revealed a new trophy that the winning coach would hoist, and it just isn't the same as the Crystal Ball. Obviously, we know now that 10 years after this implementation, we will see a new playoff format of 12 teams. So, be on the lookout for another 10-year retrospective from me in 2034. There were also a number of rule changes for the upcoming season. The targeting rule was modified to allow the flag to be picked up if the targeting call was overturned upon replay. They also updated the definition from initiating contact to making forcible contact, and defining that any forcible contact with the crown of the helmet is a targeting foul. I'm glad they cleared that up because we all know what targeting is now, and there's never a debate about it anytime it's called. The ACC, Big Ten, Big 12, Mountain West, and American conferences all implemented 8-man officiating crews for the season, while the SEC said, we'll test it out for a couple games, and the Pac-12 outright refused to change anything. Roughing the passer was expanded upon to include hits at or below the knees of a quarterback. Thanks, Tom Brady. This is kind of a strange one, but the chain gang will now work the first half of the game on the same side as the press box and then switch sides at half. Previously, they had worked the entire game on the sideline opposite of the press box. There was also a rule aimed at slowing down hurry-up offenses that would prevent them from snapping the ball within the first 10 seconds of the play clock to allow for substitutions on defense. Violating this rule would result in a 5-yard delay of game penalty, except within the final 2 minutes of a half or when the play clock was set to 25 seconds. This rule was ultimately tabled by the Rules Committee and not voted on. Obviously, I think that's the right call, as slowing the game down is the exact opposite of what people want, and I like the rule allowing the defense to substitute only when the offense does. And lest we forget, 2014 would see the Big Ten drop their Leaders and Legends division for a more traditional East and West. Ugh. Sorry, too soon. Actually, realignment was not earth-shattering 10 years ago. The biggest movers were Louisville, moving from the American to the ACC, filling the void from Maryland going to the Big Ten, and Rutgers also leaving the American to join the Big Ten. We also saw the introduction of two FCS teams as App State and Georgia Southern. Both joined the Sun Belt from the FCS Southern Conference. Previous FBS edition Old Dominion went from being an independent to joining CUSA. New Mexico State and Idaho also ditched the Indies to join the Sun Belt. And since the American lost Louisville and Rutgers, they added Tulane, Tulsa, and ECU from CUSA, and CUSA pushed Western Kentucky from the Sun Belt. Easy enough, right? There were also a number of stadium happenings for the season. Baylor welcomed on-campus games back for the first time since 1935 with the opening of McLean Stadium. It opened with a capacity of 45,000. Houston opened TDECU Stadium on the side of their old stadium, Robertson Stadium. And Tulane opened Ullman Stadium on campus near the former site of Tulane Stadium. They had played their home games for the previous 39 seasons at the Superdome. LSU, Ohio State, Texas A&M, Mississippi State, Missouri, and Louisiana Lafayette all renovated their stadiums to increase capacity, while Purdue actually decreased capacity with their reno. And Eastern Michigan installed their gray turf before the season, joining Boise State as the only FBS schools with colored playing surfaces. As expected, there were a large number of coaching changes from January 1st until kickoff, but take note of some of these moves and just how program-changing some of them were. Bill O'Brien started the year off by leaving Penn State to coach the Houston Texans on January 2nd. Of course, he would be replaced by James Franklin, who has remained in Happy Valley ever since. Charlie Strong left Louisville to take the Texas job that Mack Brown vacated when he retired, and Louisville made the always good hire of Bobby Petrino. Petrino was coaching at Western Kentucky at the time, albeit a very short tenure. He was replaced by Jeff Brom. Garrick McGee left UAB to be the OC at Louisville, and the Blazers brought in Bill Clark to be their new man. He'd be there to revive the program and did great things down in Birmingham. Since Vanderbilt lost James Franklin, they hired Derek Mason, and with the loss of Franklin, Vandy's never really reached the same success ever since. That would be it for the preseason, and we'll cover the other moves in the postseason section. The preseason top 25 looked like this. Looking at this with 2024 eyes, there are only like 3 teams that don't quite belong here. That being Stanford, Arizona State, and Nebraska, since it's been a while since any of those teams have been consistently near ranked. Now let's take a quick look at your preseason All-Americans. Jameis Winston leads the offense, along with running backs Todd Gurley and Melvin Gordon. Out wide, you had Antoine Goodley, Amari Cooper, and Nick O'Leary lining up at tight end. The offensive line consisted of Cedric Ogbui, A.J. Cann, Haranis Grasu, Gazunite, Trey Jackson, and Andres Pete. They had to guard against Vic Beasley, Leonard Williams, Shalik Calhoun, Miles Jack, Rameek Wilson, A.J. Johnson, and Eric Stryker. The defensive secondary looked like this. Had Vernon Hargraves, Cody Pruitt, Jalen Ramsey, and Kendall Fuller. Roberto Aguayo kicked, Drew Kaiser punted, and Ryan Switzer returned them. And then we had Tyler Lockett as an all-purpose player. As impressive as that lineup is, I think the second team actually turned out to be even more loaded. The 2014 season kicked off in Week 1. Georgia State beat Abilene Christian on a Wednesday. TAMU beat the Cox bad. Ole Miss would end Boise State's opening week magic against Power 5 schools. Akron blanked Howard 41-zip, which they probably couldn't do against a D2 team today. Syracuse beat Villanova 27-26, which would happen today if they played after September. Michigan got their revenge on App State, beating the Mountaineers 52-14. Number 12 Georgia laid the smackdown on number 16 Clemson 45-21. North Dakota State, well, they just did North Dakota State things by beating Iowa State 34-14. Number 1 Florida State got the best of Oklahoma State 37-31. Number 25 Washington went to Hawaii and took a 17-10 lead into halftime. Hawaii would score just 6 points in the second half, and the Huskies would get the 17-16 win for Coach Pete. Alabama wasn't really tested against West Virginia. Number 13 LSU needed a 17-point rally to beat number 14 Wisconsin in Houston. Baylor would blank SMU in their new stadium, and Louisville wrapped up the opening weekend by beating Miami 31-13. Now for the rest of the season, I'm going to try to hit the hot spots. BYU showed that Texas wasn't really Texas anymore. In fact, just about everyone did that. Texas went 6-7 with their only ranked win coming against West Virginia. Ranked Mizzou traveled to Toledo? Notre Dame would blank Michigan 31-zip. Number 2 Oregon started their march towards the playoffs by shellacking number 7 Michigan State. The college football world was introduced to Kenny Thrill, and then they would send a search party out for him at the end of the season. Ohio State would ruin their chances at the playoffs when they lost to Virginia Tech, and everyone wondered if Urban was just a myth. Boston College upsets a top 10 USC in Sark's first year. Fresh off their upset of Ohio State, Virginia Tech would lose to ECU. Iowa State would claim their third Cy-Hawk in the last 4 seasons. Number 24 South Carolina would upset number 6 Georgia. Just wait 5 years. ECU would continue their destructive ways, this time boat racing UNC 70-41. In the battle for the ACC Atlantic Division, FSU would best Clemson. In another upset, Indiana beat number 8 team Missouri. On their way to being the inaugural CFP number 1, Mississippi State would pick up their first of 3 consecutive top 10 wins when they beat LSU. What about Yale beating Army 49-43? Arizona would edge out Oregon and use that win, along with a 5-0 record developed from unranked to 10th in the nation. They would promptly lose to USC, but they would claw their way back to the top 10 and the Pac-12 championship game against Oregon. Then you had Utah State handing BYU and Taysom Hill their first loss of the season. Washington State quarterback Connor Halliday threw for an FBS record 734 yards against Cal, while their quarterback Jared Goff had a nice day himself with 527. This would set an FBS record for pass yards in a game at 1,261. Halliday would throw 6 touchdowns with no picks, while Goff threw 5 touchdowns also with no picks. Washington State would go on to lose that one 60-59 in regulation. And who could forget when 4 of the top 6 teams lost in the same week? The aforementioned Oregon lost to Arizona, Bama losing to Ole Miss, Oklahoma going down to playoff contender TCU, feel like I've seen that one before, Mississippi State taking down TAMU, and UCLA losing at home to Utah. Boys, it's just how we like our weekends. Chaotic. Unless we forget the legendary battle between Florida and Tennessee. Now let's take a second to discuss Georgia Tech. Paul Johnson's crew was coming off a 7-6 season, but what they did was outstanding. They started off 5-0 to be ranked 22nd, but would lose their first game as a ranked team falling to Duke. And then the next week, they would lose to North Carolina, and it looked like they might have cooled off from their hot start. Then, they rattled off 3 straight wins to become ranked again, but this time, they would stay ranked as they defeated Clemson and then number 8 Georgia to close the regular season. They would face Florida State in the ACC championship game, but would lose by 2 points. But they would rebound from that by beating up Mississippi State in the Orange Bowl to finish 11-3. TCU and Baylor would have an instant classic matchup between 2 top 10 teams looking to make their way to the playoffs. After seemingly having Alabama's number, Texas A&M would get assaulted 59-0 by the Tide. In a tale as old as time, Notre Dame would lose a top 5 matchup, this time 31-27 against Florida State. Baylor would crash after their thrilling win against Hypno-Toad and lose 41-27 to unranked West Virginia. LSU and Ole Miss showed the world what the SEC was all about when the Tigers came away with a 10-7 win in a night game in Death Valley. The Gators would chomp the Dogs by 18, and what I hear was the world's largest outdoor cocktail party. Sounds fun. Number 21, East Carolina would meet their match in a 4-3 Temple. Arizona State flexed their muscle and their 11th ranking against Notre Dame. Baylor took their frustrations out on Oklahoma. Boise State and New Mexico combined for 109 points. And number 23, Marshall hung 63 on Southern Miss. And let's do a quick dive into the Thundering Herd. Quarterback Rakeem Cato was entering his senior year and his 4th year of playing really good football for Coach Doc Holliday. By the way, one of the greatest coach names of all time. They had a great 10-3 record in 2013, but wanted to raise the bar for 14. Cato threw for just under 4,000 yards with a 40-13 touchdown to interception ratio. He also ran 8 in on the ground. They averaged over 45 points a game, and their only loss of the season was a 67-66 loss to Western Kentucky in overtime when the Hilltoppers got the walk-off 2-point conversion. In that game, Cato threw for 417 yards, 7 touchdowns, but 4 interceptions. His opponent, Brandon Doughty, 491, 8 scores, 2 picks. Also, to note in that game, you would be hard-pressed to name a receiver on that Marshall team while WKU had Tyler Higbee and Tywan Taylor. Also, Cato set an FBS record with a touchdown pass in 46 consecutive games, breaking the record of 38 set by Russell Wilson and tying him with the all-division record with Central Washington's Mike Riley. Marshall would be the CUSA champions and defeat Northern Illinois in the Boca Raton Bowl, while finishing 13-1 and ranked 23rd in the final rankings. Number 4, Alabama would host undefeated number 1 Mississippi State and would hand them their first loss with a score of 25-20. In the same season that they handled Penn State, Northwestern would upset number 15 Notre Dame to drop them out of the rankings for the rest of the season. Number 22, Wisconsin beat number 11 Nebraska 59-24, but all anyone could talk about was Melvin Gordon rushing for 508 in that game, setting an FBS record in the process. People talked about it so much that Samaje Perine got sick of it during the week and ran for 427 against Kansas to prove that Gordon, he wasn't too special. So 2 new records in 2 weeks for the running backs. With rivalry week signaling the end of the regular season, we had some outcomes that would send teams to the postseason with a boost of confidence, and others would affect the CFP itself. So let's start with an unranked Stanford beating number 9 UCLA 31-10. Alabama and Auburn producing a high-scoring Iron Bowl, with Bama keeping their playoff hopes alive and well for one more week. Number 5 Baylor and Bryce Petty keeping their name in the CFP conversation with a 48-46 thriller over Texas Tech. Number 18 Ole Miss ruining the playoff chances of Dak Prescott as number 4 Mississippi State lost 31-17 in the Egg Bowl. And then Louisville beating Kentucky 44-40. It was actually during this game, Louisville safety Gerard Holloman intercepted his 14th pass of the campaign, which tied the FBS single-season record set in 1968 by Washington's Al Worley. That pick actually helped seal the win for the Governor's Cup. So going into Conference Championship Week, the CFP top 6 looked like this: Alabama, Oregon, TCU, Florida State, Ohio State, and Baylor. For the 2 looking in, the formula was simple. Overcome your lone loss by winning your championship and scoring a lot of points. Both teams won their conferences, and the points were aplenty for both. Ohio State scored at least 50 on all but 3 of their regular season opponents, and Baylor averaged just under 49 points a game to that point. Only, there were a couple things separating the 2 teams. Ohio State's loss came in week 2, while the Bears lost to West Virginia in their 7th game. Another thing is, while the Buckeyes won their conference outright, in dominant fashion in a conference championship against Wisconsin, Baylor was declared co-champions with TCU since the Big 12 didn't have a title game at the time. One would think that a hypothetical tiebreaker would go to Baylor since they had the head-to-head win during the season, but TCU was ranked higher in the CFP rankings. Well, it turns out that the lack of a championship game would probably hurt them both and the conference as a whole, as they would both miss out on the Final Four. As we start winding down this historic season, let's take a quick look at each conference's championship game. Northern Illinois would be the first champion crowned as they defeated Bowling Green for the MAC title. As we noted previously, Marshall would come out on top against La Tech to win the CUSA crown. Boise State would take home their 2nd Mountain West championship in 3 years when they beat Fresno State on the Smurf turf. The rest of the championship games would have playoff ramifications. Oregon would get their revenge against Arizona by pummeling them 51-13 and cementing their place in the inaugural college football playoff. Alabama would handle a scrappy Missouri team to take home the SEC gold yet again. As previously mentioned, Ohio State made their statement by beating number 11 Wisconsin 59-0 in the Big Ten title game. And Florida State battled with Georgia Tech for the ACC championship, coming out on top 37-35. With those results coming in throughout the day, all these teams could do now was wait until the final CFP rankings were released the very next day. When the dust settled on Selection Day, it was determined that the 4 teams battling for the very first CFP trophy would be Alabama versus Ohio State, and Florida State taking on Oregon. Bowl season got off to a hot start with the always fun Popeyes Bahamas Bowl pitting Western Kentucky against Central Michigan. This game saw the Chippewas' Cooper Rush pass for 7 touchdowns, while WKU's Brandon Dowdy tossed 5. Interestingly enough, Rush had 485 yards, while Dowdy had 486. The Hilltoppers will come out on top 49-48 after Central Michigan scored 34 in the final quarter, culminating in this Hail Mary and laterals. Instead of sending the game to OT, Dan Enos decided to go for the win and the 2-point try, but was unsuccessful. Then, who could ever forget the Russell Athletic Bowl? For some, just uttering that name will bring back memories of 40-6. Well, that's because that was the final score as Clemson took Oklahoma to the woodshed. Notre Dame kind of recovered their lost season as they beat LSU in the Music City Bowl. Boise State reminded the world that they loved the Fiesta Bowl as they defeated number 12 Arizona. Fresh off of missing out on the CFP, number 6 TCU dropped a nuke on Ole Miss, winning 42-3. But the same could not be said for their Big 12 brethren as Baylor lost a shootout to number 7 Michigan State, 42-41. Scrappy ECU took Florida to their limits, but the Gators got out of Birmingham alive, 28-20. And Tennessee surprisingly took Iowa to task. No, this isn't a 2023 retrospective. Winning the Taxslayer Bowl 45-28 and setting expectations way too high for the following season. Name a better duo. In the CFP semis, Heisman winner Marcus Mariota and Oregon sent Jameis stumbling out of college football when they beat Florida State 59-20 in the Rose Bowl in what was the first ever game of the CFP. Then, down in the Sugar Bowl, Alabama got off to a 21-6 lead against Ohio State, and Bama fans started booking their flights to Jerry World, only for Ohio State to fight back and take the thrilling 42-35 win, and Zeke Elliott coming away with this highlight run. Our season comes to this, the final battle for the grandest prize. A fantastic build-up gave way to an anticlimactic finish as Ohio State and Zeke Elliott ran away from Oregon and won the first college football playoff with a score of 42-20. This would pretty much earn Urban Meyer a lifetime contract at Ohio State, where he would remain for the rest of his career while establishing himself as a beacon of his community and cementing his legacy as the greatest family man the sport has ever seen. It was reported on December 8th that the Big 12 was looking to expand their conference even before they kind of got screwed out of the CFP due to the structure of said conference. One of the targets named in their expansion was the University of Cincinnati. Those discussions later fell through, but could you imagine Cincinnati in the Big 12? That doesn't make much sense. With all the games out of the way, we could start our favorite part of the season, the coaching carousel. UAB cleaned house on December 2nd when they announced that they would be dropping their football program at the conclusion of the season. Buffalo fired Jeff Quinn in October, and interim Alex Wood would be replaced by Lance Leipold, fresh out of the D3 ranks and Wisconsin Whitewater. Central Michigan's Dan Enos was hired to be the OC at Arkansas and was replaced by John Bonamigo. I don't even know who that is. After Florida's disastrous season, they lured notorious aquatic animal lover Jim McElwain from Colorado State, and the Rams went and got Mike Bobo. Tom Herman took over for Tony Levine in Houston in what would turn out to be a fairly successful tenure. Kansas fired Charlie Weiss, and David Beatty eventually took the job. Solid hire. Michigan finally gave up on Brady Hoke and brought in Michigan man Jim Harbaugh. I think we all know how that one ended up. Nebraska fired Bo Pelini essentially for being a potty mouth, but at least he was a potty mouth who could win games. He was replaced with Mike Riley. Paul Chryst was hired by Wisconsin, and Pitt tabbed Pat Narduzzi to be their coach, but not before badass Barry Alvarez would lead Wisconsin in their bowl game. Oregon State filled their vacancy left by Mike Riley with Wisconsin's Gary Anderson. Chad Morris replaced June Jones at SMU. Troy's longtime coach Larry Blakeney retired, leaving the team that he had led since 1991, where they were D2 Troy State. Neil Brown became the new head man there. At Tulsa, Bill Blankenship was out and Philip Montgomery was in. And lastly, UNLV moved on from Bobby Hauck and brought in Tony Sanchez. And for our final piece of this retrospective on the 2014 season, let's take a look at the All-America team. Quarterback Marcus Mariota led the offense along with running backs Tevin Coleman, James Conner, and Melvin Gordon. Out wide, we have Amari Cooper, Rashard Higgins, Jalen Strong, and Kevin White. 3 tight ends were selected, Nick O'Leary, Clive Walford, and Max Williams. And blocking on the line were linemen Jack Allen, A.J. Cann, Kyle Costigan, Reese Demukes, Spencer Drongo, Always said Drongo, I think it's Drango. Cameron Irving, Jake Fisher, Haranis Grasu, Rob Havenstein, Trey Jackson, Ari Kwanjo, Shaquille Mason, Cedric Akbui, Andres Pete, Brandon Scherf, and Laken Tomlinson. Defensively, we see a lot of the same names as the preseason team. Vic Beasley, Michael Bennett, Joey Bosa, Malcolm Brown, Eddie Goldman, Nate Orchard, Shane Ray, Denny Sheldon, and Leonard Williams up front. Linebackers Paul Dawson, Trey DePriest, Eric Kendricks, Haoli Kakaha, Benardrick McKinney, Shaq Thompson, and Scooby Wright. Defensive backs consisted of Landon Collins, Curtis Drummond, Ifre Ekbre Alamu, Sinquez Golson, Vernon Hargraves, Gerard Holloman, and Jalen Ramsey. Kickers Roberto Aguayo and Brad Craddock. Punters Tom Hackett and J.K. Scott, with all-purpose/return specialists Mario Alford, Kalen Clay, Tyler Lockett, Marcus Murphy, J.J. Nelson, and Shaq Thompson. So there you have it. A fairly comprehensive look at what college football was like 10 years ago. It's a good look at a somewhat similar time in the game, but one where we didn't have wild conference realignments or transfer portals. And players were still being paid just under the veil of darkness and bagmen, and maybe McDonald's bags. I will continue to periodically do these retrospectives, with recruits most likely being the next topic of one of these. But if there's anything else you'd like to see on the channel, just comment below. And as always, like this, subscribe, and share with just one other fan who might enjoy this. So whether you had this on in the background while you worked, had it sitting on the table while you ate dinner, or anything else in between, I thank you for watching, and I'll catch you next time.